Hey, it's Lou, and some wild shit is going down in the Maldives. The country, a string of some 1,200 picture-perfect islands in the Indian Ocean, is frequently described as heaven on earth. But Maldivian politics? They're an authoritarian hellscape. A brazenly corrupt government uses gangs for hire to terrorize critics. Dissidents are arbitrarily jailed or disappeared. Attending a protest, speaking your mind, practicing journalism, those are all very dangerous endeavors. The irony is, this is a country that pushed out a dictator and tried building a democracy just a decade ago. Unfortunately, that experiment failed. Can it be tried again? Or will this paradise descend further into tyranny? In July 1965, the Maldives gained independence from the British. 13 years later, an Islamic scholar named Gayoom became president. Gayoom would become the longest-serving leader in Asia, winning 6 unopposed elections. He also survived a coup attempt in the 1980s. Gayoom improved the economy and turned the Maldives into one of the premier tourist destinations in the world. But he's also been described as a dictator who ruled with an iron fist. Critics claim his 30-year reign was characterized by cronyism, nepotism, corruption, and the stifling of political dissent. Critics were exiled. Others were just plain old tortured. Some were handcuffed to coconut trees and covered in sugar water. Ants would eat them. Simultaneously, Gayoom bought loyalty through a patronage system. He filled the government with folks who he could control, who wouldn't challenge his power or prosecute his corruption. J.J. Robinson, author of the fascinating book The Maldives, Islamic Republic, Tropical Autocracy, told me despite this intimidation and manipulation, Gayoom was seen as a father figure, an authority on all things Islam who was almost above reproach. His reputation was nearly godlike. Keep in mind, this is in a very strict Islamic society where booze is as illegal as heroin, and where extramarital sex is punished with flogging. Well, not for the tourists, but that's a contradiction tolerated for the sake of the economy. Anyway, Gayoom's status as a religious scholar made his autocratic tendencies tolerable. But that changed in 2003, when a 19-year-old prisoner was killed by a guard. His mother displayed his brutalized corpse to the public. Here was undeniable proof of the regime's cruelness. The violent suppression of subsequent protests underscored that point. Then, in 2004, a tsunami dealt a major blow to the country. The economic destruction totaled over 60% of GDP. Gayoom was vulnerable. Maldivians wanted change. Pressure was coming from the international community, too. So, Gayoom offered some reforms. A new constitution was written. But more importantly, Gayoom promised that the 2008 election would be free and fair. A journalist and activist named Nasheed became the chief opposition candidate. Nasheed had actually been arrested 23 times under Gayoom for critical coverage. He had been tortured and spent 18 months in solitary confinement. He got his revenge at the ballot box. His successful campaign finally toppled the autocrat. The world celebrated the fact that the Maldives had embraced democracy. The international accolades continued to roll in as Nasheed introduced universal health care, set up a pension system, and offered welfare to single parents and the elderly. He also revamped the tax code and created laws that allowed more people to profit from the tourism industry. Nasheed was also a big climate change advocate. He held a cabinet meeting underwater to bring attention to how the issue was impacting the low-lying and very vulnerable Maldives. Money for environmental projects started pouring into the country. Good thing, because the old regime had depleted the state coffers on their way out the door. Actually, Gayoom and his cronies never really left. They lurked in the background. Nasheed sensed this, later writing, "Dictatorships don't always die when the dictator leaves office. Long after the revolutions, powerful networks of regime loyalists can remain behind and can attempt to strangle their nascent democracies." Patricia Gossman, a researcher at Human Rights Watch, told me Gayoom's puppets still held many government posts, especially in the uber-powerful judiciary. Most of the judges had no training. A quarter had criminal records. 60% had less than a grade 7 education. Their only qualification was that they would do whatever Gayoom ordered. Nasheed never succeeded at getting rid of them. Plus, Nasheed's coalition didn't have a majority in parliament, so his agenda was undermined there. Now, when Nasheed did try to tackle some of the entrenched powers by imprisoning a chief judge of the criminal court credibly accused of abuse of office, well, the old regime reared its ugly head and all hell broke loose. police joined a violent protest against Nasheed. They distributed riot gear to other demonstrators, so the tear gas from the military defending Nasheed was ineffectual. Besides, some of the military switched sides and actually joined in on the protest. It was a chaotic, confusing scene. Nasheed was trapped inside a military base. A faction of the protesters went to the state broadcaster and switched the feed to a private pro-Gayoom station.
This morning, police took over the state broadcaster.
Others went to the National Museum and destroyed artifacts associated with the Maldives' pre-Islamic history.
The items destroyed include one-of-a-kind Buddhist statues from the 12th century, before Islam came to the islands. Some consider such things idols.
President Nasheed was dragged in front of TV cameras and forced to resign. He later said he did it under duress. No shit. His vice president, who had become a bit of a malcontent frenemy, was sworn in. There's evidence that the VP knew about Nasheed's forced resignation in advance, but he played dumb, claiming to be shocked and merely ready to step up and serve his country. His wife wasn't so surprised. She had gotten her hair done that morning for a mysterious special occasion. Many people in the Maldives saw this as a pre-planned coup, not a spontaneous uprising to defend a dubious judge. There were protests. Those were met with state-sanctioned violence. Democracy was fading fast. But there was a glimmer of hope. About a year after Nasheed's resignation, the Maldives were due for their next presidential election, and Nasheed sought to regain his seat. His successor, the former VP, was deeply unpopular, so his main opposition was Gayoom's half-brother, Abdullah Yameen. The election was suspicious. The first round, which Nasheed won handily, was invalidated by the corrupt as always courts. That created a bunch of controversies and a bunch of delays. One of the delays was caused by someone slipping laxatives into the parliament's coffee. Eventually, Yameen and Nasheed go head-to-head in a runoff. In his book, Robinson describes Yameen buying votes. His supporters would literally hand out cash. Voters held out for higher and higher bribes. Yameen also painted Nasheed as a bad Muslim, a secularist influenced by foreigners bent on undermining Islam. At the end of the day, after all these dubious campaign irregularities, Yameen won. A Gayoom family member was back in power, and once again, he turned the Maldives into an autocracy where the well-connected got rich and the citizenry got repressed. Amnesty International said human rights in the country have been in a free fall. Ahmed Thalal, a program coordinator at Transparency Maldives, told me Yameen controls parliament so he can tweak laws and amend the constitution to suit his needs. This gives the administration the facade of legality and legitimacy, but they really use state institutions to execute their own self-dealing agenda. Gossman told me the regime uses intentionally broad and vaguely worded laws to arrest, intimidate, and imprison critics. Negatively influencing the government or state, whatever the hell that means, is defined as terrorism. The right to assemble has been deteriorated. At one protest, according to allegations in the Human Rights Watch report, police moved their barricade behind law-abiding protesters and then arrested the protesters for supposedly crossing said barricade. Yameen's government has also jailed opposition leaders. 10 of the country's 16 political parties have been shut down. Former President Nasheed was arrested and sentenced to 13 years in prison on politically motivated charges. He sought refuge in the UK, where attorney Amal Clooney represented him. Then there's the violence. Robinson told me a lot of the state's brutality has been contracted out to street gangs who originally specialized in the drug trade. Now, they do Yameen's dirty work. One gang set fire to a TV station critical of the regime. Journalists have been threatened with machetes. Gossman told me all this is done with complete impunity. With Yameen's protection, the gangs never get punished. Thalal told me the connection between the gangs and the ruling party is totally brazen. The violent enforcers appear on stage at campaign rallies. They participate in photo ops. No one tries to hide it. In fact, one of Yameen's former vice presidents asserted in a text that he was the boss of all gangs in the Maldives. That VP also ran a corruption scheme dubbed the Bro Economy. The con was simple. As outlined in a stunning Al Jazeera documentary and a brand new report from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, Yameen's intermediaries would sell Maldivian islands to resort developers and simply pocket the cash. Money that was supposed to go to the state instead went to Yameen and his cronies. The scam pulled in nearly $80 million.
For the president, it is not I mean, it's difficult to carry.
But Yameen eventually became deeply paranoid. That's not a surprise. This is a guy who reportedly has practitioners of black magic working for him. So, after a small explosion on his boat, probably an accident, since international investigators found no evidence of a bomb, Yameen accused the bro-economy VP of an assassination attempt. That guy was jailed. Other ministers were replaced or arrested. All this got a little too much, even for the corrupt judiciary. Whether or not they sold their allegiance to a different political party is a topic of speculation in the Maldives. But whatever the case, in February 2018, the judiciary ruled that political prisoners should be set free. Yameen was not happy about this. He declared a state of emergency and arrested the offending judges. His police force blocked rival politicians from entering parliament, thereby preventing legislative reforms. He even jailed his half-brother Gayoom. Yes, the former dictator was put in prison. The two autocrats, longtime family rivals, had a falling out over how the government accepted bids for the sale of islands. The UN said all these moves were tantamount to an all-out assault on democracy. Now, the state of emergency was eventually lifted, but Yameen has kept a tight grip on the levers of the government. Bilal told me he now operates with complete impunity. All checks and balances have been eliminated. Meanwhile, Islamic extremism is flourishing in the country, where the constitution requires every citizen to be a Muslim. By some accounts, the Maldives send more fighters per capita to Syria and Iraq than any other country. A bunch of Maldivians recently held an elaborate reenactment of 9/11 in which a model plane on a zip line crashed into a mock twin tower, which was then lit on fire. Look, it's all one twisted, crazy, weird, and very corrupt situation, and one you're not going to read about on tourism brochures. For those on vacation, ignorance is bliss. And I haven't even touched on the global grand game dynamic. Through their One Belt, One Road initiative, China keeps pouring more and more money into the country for strategic purposes. Gossman told me the Chinese simply turn a blind eye towards all the human rights abuses. Meanwhile, India is getting nervous that the Chinese are making inroads into a neighboring country that they once heavily influenced. So the Maldives are also a pawn in a bigger game. And in this complex environment, on September 23rd, the presidential election was held. All the experts I spoke to said they were not expecting the election to be free or fair. They all suspected that Yameen would somehow lie, cheat, and steal his way to another repressive presidential term. And in fact, on the night before the vote, the police raided the campaign headquarters of Yameen's biggest rival. That's Ibrahim Muhammad Soli. Meanwhile, several international observers who were supposed to monitor the legitimacy of the election couldn't enter the Maldives because they were never issued visas. The fix seemed to be in. But in a jaw-dropping turn of events, Soli won. Voters pushed out Yameen, the autocrat. The overwhelming advantages he had, including the incumbency and control over the state's institutions, including the impunity and shamelessness to intimidate and harass opponents, those weren't enough. When it mattered most, Maldivians chose democracy. It was a type of pleasant surprise that both rattled my cynicism and represents a major victory for freedom and human rights. Questions still linger about the transition from Yameen's autocratic regime to the newly elected one. Will Soli's reform efforts be plagued by the same government holdovers that ultimately brought down Nasheed? Can institutions like the traditionally corrupt and incompetent judiciary and police forces be reformed? For what it's worth, Yameen did offer a concession, so perhaps he's willing to hand over power peacefully. Perhaps this time around, the second time around, democracy will flourish in the Maldives. As the newly elected president said in his victory speech, this is a moment of happiness, hope, and history.